Hey everyone, we're into the last week of the course and wanted to give you some advice that's for preparing for the final, but I also think is, kind of summing up the change, the approach you should be taking to questions, to, situations where, hey, I have to think about international relations. And I think, it all comes together in, hey, you're going to prepare to answer questions on this comprehensive exam, on this final exam, which is much like the comprehensive exam, except it's not going to be comprehensive. You have a much better clue about what you're going to have to talk about. But that's very similar to, a situation where, hey, I need to find out something about the world, so I think the two are very closely tied to, what I want you to do in the final, what we want you to do in the comp, and what a real life application should be, what you should be able to do as a master's degree student in IR. So, having defended the exam, the validity of it, I should say, we're going to have, as on the midterm, there'll be two essay questions. You'll pick one. And I'm letting you know that one essay question is on the United Nations, and the other essay question is on human rights. That kind of narrows the field for you. Which is, I think, important because this is a proctored test. It is proctored, closed book and note. You have arranged to be proctored either live someplace, or you've got ProctorU, so they're going to do they're going to have somebody watch you through your laptop. It's closed book and note, which means you've got to kind of sit down and come up with this stuff off the top of your head. So this is exactly the way the comp is going to be at the end of the program, except you'll have four. It'll be this times four. So we're starting off, I'm kind of giving you a taste of it, although I'm trying to help you by narrowing what it's going to be on. But, this is a crawl, walk, run thing, and I'm trying to give you so it's really good preparation for that future. It will be 90 minutes. You will have 90 minutes you'll be taking on your computer, and so, you got to be ready to give me 90 minutes of stuff, which, of course, you had 90 minutes for the midterm, but that was open book. In closed book, it might actually be faster because you're not having to spend time looking stuff up. The challenge for you: write a theory-based essay with references off the top of your head in 90 minutes. That's it. Nothing big. Key thing, when I say references, you don't have to have the full bibliographic citation in your head. What you do have to have is the author's names, right? Date would be nice, but really the names, this person. In this environment, that's what we need, right? And that's the concession, I think, to not having your notes there. But, if you can say Waltz, if you can tell me that it's, Madeleine Albright said this, you're good to go. So that's the king. Keep the author at the forefront of you, in your mind, okay? The questions you're going to find here are more practical. The other questions we've had have been very theoretical, and these final questions are going to be practical questions about the United Nations, about efforts on human rights. A little bit more information right there. And generally I'll also share with you, there's a the slant of effectiveness is going to come into play. And so these are policy type questions. That's what I mean by practical. They are not these theoretical, how do realists compare? The questions are not automatically asking you to talk about theory. Well, the thing is, even with practical questions, you should be approaching it from a theoretical point of view. You should be thinking about cause and effect, right? Because very often that's implied in these things, right? And anytime cause and effect is in play, we're asking, hey, if one thing happens, what's the effect on something else? Well, that's the realm of theory, right? And so you need to be in a theoretical point of view. Also, so before I go into also, got to have that, and this is the trick. If someone throws a question at you of human rights, if someone throws a question of you about the World Trade Organization, if someone throws a question about this UN Security Council, these are not. That's not what but these are not exactly the things you're going to have this week. But I'm trying to say any kind of question about nuclear non-proliferation, right? These are not automatically theoretical questions, but you need to be using theory to answer them. This is, by the way, what kills people when they take the comp. And so I'm really trying to pound my foot and to get you guys thinking this way ahead of time. Finally, empirical findings must be referenced. This is something you have to be careful of. If you're going to talk about the world, to a certain level, there's some factual knowledge that you don't have to reference, right? If you want to talk about the United Nations, right, you don't have to reference where that came from, or the Security Council. If you want to talk about the Millennium Development Grant, or any of these things, and that last one's not necessarily on this exam, by the way. But if you want to talk about that kind of stuff, the Iran-Iraq War, right? You don't have to reference these things. That we know they happened. However, there are findings, right? Like if you want to say, well, the world appears to be a safer place. We have less war out there. Well, you've got to cite the Human Security Report that I gave you, right? And this is the kind of thing that is unnerving to you. There are a lot of little factoids that you have collected in the course, and you've got to remember where those came from, right? And you've got to be able to say where those came from. So you have to refresh your memory on those things, and you have to always be careful about making assertions about history. And like the plague, you need to avoid statements like history shows, because research might have shown it. And if research has shown, say, that democratic nations don't fight each other, all right, that's an old part. Not something that might come up this time, but hey, you've got to point to some. You've got to say, okay, well, who's the research on that? Who came up with that? And in general, anytime you are tempted to say something has shown, well, if you want to say history has shown, well, history doesn't show anything. People show things. People think things. People write books. People tell you things about the world. And so anytime you want to say something is shown, you're implying a person. Well, who is that person? Anytime you want to say some would argue, right, you have to keep in mind that you can't get away with that. You have to, who argued that, right? And so these are the things you have to be careful of and be ready to fill in the blanks. And you can get away with a blank here or there, but in general, you want to be ready for this stuff. And so I'm not trying to freak you out, but I am trying to say, this is what you're going to have to do, so maybe over the next few days, you should prepare appropriately. And what have you got to do, right? And here what I'm trying to say is, what are you supposed to do with this challenge? How are you supposed to meet these things? I think, especially when you're dealing with this problem of, here's a practical question that, comes out of the quote-unquote real world, and how am I supposed to apply these abstract theories? Well, I think you have to recognize, first of all, that it's not a fall from grace, that you're actually, I think the very first step in this process is to go and say, all right, of what general category of phenomena is this an example? So if I have a question about the United Nations, right, don't just think of it as a question about the United Nations. Try to, your first thing should be to say, what category am I looking at here? Right? And I think the idea is pretty obvious. It's an international institution. Well, we've got a whole bunch of theory relevant to international institutions, right? There might not be a lot of theory about UN, but there's a lot of theory about international institutions. With human rights, you say, all right, well, what are human rights an example of? What general category, in what category does human rights fit? And you could say, well, it could fit into international norms. Once you start talking norms, whoa, who talks about norms? Constructivists are all about the norms, right? Because the norm, like, don't beat innocent people to death, right? Don't throw people into jail without, don't kill babies, right? These are norms. Human rights. Don't do that. We would like it very much if you didn't do that. That kind of norm is at the heart of what human rights is about, I think, you could argue, and therefore, how do we think norms work? Right? Constructivists are on that. Finnemore and Sickick have their norm life cycle theory, right? And so there's, we're automatically, bam, we're putting it in a context. It could also be that it's international law, right? And there are some theories of international law. We haven't hit that as much, but we have some people talking about it a little bit, about how effective international laws can be, and I do, I have a paper, so I gave you a paper to read to help you. Or human rights could be, you could view human rights in the context of international institutions, that are trying to enforce these norms. So it could raise this. So the point is, there could be several categories that things fit in. To give you an example that won't be relevant to your final exam, when the Arab Spring came along, right? Everyone looked at, everyone's really interested in that, and really when I looked at it, I said, oh, this is interesting. How do I understand this, right? And I had to ask myself, well, what is the Arab Spring an example of? Is it democratic transition? And there's, it helps when you have more familiarity with the field, that there are things there, right? Like things that are objects of study, and you need to know the categories, right? And there's a whole literature on democratic transitions. Cool. And then Libya starts fighting. Well, Libya, is it a democratic transition, or now do we have an insurgency, or is this just a frickin' civil war? And then we had a foreign intervention. You see what I'm saying? Is there a lot of different categories, and depending on your interest, why are you interested in the event often tells you what category it's in. Are you interested? Usually you're interested in it as an example of something. How do you view it? Do you view the Arab Spring as a wave of extremism? Do you view it as a democratic transition, as a rebellion, as a revolution? See, all of these different categories are out there. And then once you figure out what it is, you go and you look up the theories on how do democratic transitions work. What's the critical, what are the critical things that help it? And that's where we get into the next step. Because the key thing for you to figure out when trying to apply theories is, what is the relevant dependent variable or variables? That is to say, what are you trying to explain? And what's important to explain. Now, in some ways, the question will tell you, when you're answering an essay question, the question's going to tell you, right? So if the question is, about the United Nations, you might say, well, it's about international institutions, great, but what's the question? Sometimes people will look at institutions and they'll try to understand where they came from. How do they get formed? And we may look at the EU with great interest. How did this occur? How did this thing come into being? With an eye to, can it exist elsewhere? Right? Can we get one of these things going in South America or in the small Asian states? At which point the dependent variable is development, or the emergence of it. That's what you're trying to explain. On the other hand, you might be interested. All right, once it exists, let's just take that its existence is given. How effective is it? Does it actually do anything? Right? That would be a different dependent variable. And so you have to figure that out, and you have to look at your theories and make sure that when you're looking at things, that you're looking at theories that have the dependent variable in which you're interested in, right? And in the essay exam, you have to be ready for multiple effectiveness. Go with effectiveness. But you've got to say, all right, this is what the theory explains, and different theories will explain different things, and they'll have different dependent variables. And very often, though, in life, what you're interested in is based on what you're interested in. The dependent variable of interest is based on your interest as a researcher, and you're coming in, what am I interested in knowing about the Arab Spring, right? Is it going to, what's the outcome likely to be, right? So, I want to look at democratic transitions, and a lot of the research on democratic transitions goes into, well, when do they occur? What's it take to spark one? Well, if you're studying the Arab Spring, right, you're sitting there, it's been sparked, right? Guy went downtown and immolated himself, and boom, we're off to the race. So that that overcome. Now what we're interested in is, well, what's the outcome? Do they achieve democracy? What's what's likely to occur in the future? See what I mean? You got to pick your dependent variable, and so when you're researching these things, you got to keep that in mind. You always, what are the dependent variables that researchers look at, and who explains what. By the way, human rights, is the dependent variable the validity? A lot of times people argue about, is this anything that for nations to even mess with, right? A lot of the discussion of human rights is talking about the validity of it as an international issue, whereas other people, they don't worry about that, and they just say, well, how do you enforce a norm, right? And can we find examples of norms being enforced, and does this crap work? Very different discussion. So once you figured out the relevant dependent variable or variables, and in preparing for an essay exam, you'll probably want to say, well, these are the general things, right? You might want to have, under the heading of human rights, you might want to be ready to talk about the validity of the issue and the norm enforcement or some other aspect of it, right? But once you've got that, you've got to say, okay, what are the independent variables, right? And the independent variables are the variables the things that have an effect, right? They are the causes. If we think cause and effect, these are the causes. And if you want to talk about, the effectiveness of an institution, right? What makes it more or less effective? That if the effectiveness of the institution was a dependent variable in research, you will have theories and empirical research that will tell you, all right, what are the things that make an institution more or less effective? Those things are the independent variables, cause and effect, right? They are the cause. And so you want to have that in your head. What are the independent variables? Because those are the things you're going to talk about, right? And you'll say, well, here are the independent variables of what makes an international institution effective. The research says here are these things. When we look at the UN, we see that it has two of the things identify, maybe there's 5 things. Hey, it's got 2 of them, but it doesn't have 3. So we shouldn't expect much out of it. And do you see how you're, in that case, using the theory or the research, right? Because you could get that from a theory. Some guy could have a theory about, hey, there are 5 things to make an institution effective. Or there could be research, right? Someone could look at an institution and say, well, it would seem to be effective, and these are the things that seem to make it effective. And so you could have that either. That's why I always say there's theory and research that you're going to build on. You can build on either of those things, but that is using it as a foundation, right? Say, well, here are the 5 things that they think are necessary for effectiveness, or this author, Smith and McGonigal, who's a professor at Hogwarts, argue that these 5 things are necessary. UN's got 2, missing 3 of them, so we don't expect much effectiveness. Or that's the problem. See what I mean? Now that's the basis for answering a question. You just got to make sure that you're actually directly answering the question, right? But if you start out and you work in this manner, you'll do well. If you have a good starting point and then you stay on target, you'll probably do a good job on this thing. Okay, looking at the readings that I got for you this week. I got one thing from Albright, just, it's her defense of the UN from around 2003. And in some ways, this is a decoy article. This is the kind of thing that most people go to. You might not go to Madeleine Albright as your go-to person, but most people, if I say to them, if I were to give them say, okay, we're going to talk about the UN, be ready to argue about the UN, they might go and look at things written about the UN directly, right? And it seems logical, but it's avoiding that first step of what is this what general category does this fit in? But we need to have some. You do need to have some empirical. Hey, this is what's going on. So Albright is there to give you kind of an idea of she's making a defense, but in her defense, she's also pointing out criticisms. The criticisms she's responding to are criticisms. So gave you a citation for lay of the land, and that's relevant to the UN. It's kind of UN heavy set of readings here. You had a chapter though on human rights in the textbook, so go by all means. You want to look at that as well. Cohen, I gave you Cohen's Art of the Possible from the 80s. He's looking at the International Energy Agency, the IEA, and talking about international institutions. I have the Mitchell and Hensel article, and here's a real interesting one. It's an empirical piece looking at institutions, international institutions. And from this, this should be a treasure trove because it is going to have a review of the different theories, and then it's going to have empirical tests of them. And so you're going to have both theoretical and empirical tests. And the thing about a paper like this is you should come out of it not just able to talk Mitchell and Hensel, you should come out of it with a few theories. Right? You should be seeing through Mitchell and Hensel. They're going to have a discussion of theories, and so sometimes empirical papers are really good at summing up a bunch of they'll sum up 5 books and 17 papers, and they'll organize them into maybe 3 or 4 different points of view, general points of view, which is awesome. Right? They're doing the work for you, and so by all means, take it away, right? But remember to note who those original guys are, right? If there are different theoretical point of views, it's okay to learn. It's okay to let Mitchell and Hensel teach you about some other scholars. It's okay, especially in the course of preparing for a final exam, and from Mitchell and Hensel, have learned about somebody else's theoretical approach and cite them directly, right? Smith and McGonigal. If they're listed, if Mitchell and Hensel talk about Smith and McGonigal, well, then there you go. That should be another little theory that you put into your, that's another arrow for your quiver. You're filling up a quiver with theoretical and empirical arrows, right, to sling at this essay, right? So put it in the quiver. And at the end of the day, there's some empirical results. Awesome. And those, absolutely, you attribute to Mitchell and Hensel. Right? And that's fair. That's cool. I got Fang in there. I thought that was a cool, his way of looking at things. Hey, what's the effect of institutions on domestic politics? He's looking at the effectiveness of international institutions as kind of opinion leaders. What effect do they have on when the UN says something? How does that, or the IMF or the WTO, how does that impact domestic politics? So that's another model, right? And that's more directly, that's a little bit more, if Mitchell and Hensel are a Neapolitan, with the, that's the ice cream, the vanilla, the chocolate, and the strawberry, right? Fang might be just, more chocolate or vanilla, or I don't want to say he's vanilla, but more one flavor, but interesting. All right, so think of it as a mango mint flavor, right? It's one flavor, but it's interesting. For Neumeier, very interesting. Again, here we have human rights treaties, but it's empirical, right? And he's asking the question, do these treaties actually do a damn thing, right? And treaties and human rights, and of course, in there are. Again, you go through looking for other points of view that he is implicitly using. Now, when you're done with this, I think I've given you guys a fair smattering. I know it's a little more than usual, but preparing for the final. We're going to go out with a bang here. Are there others? Well, I know you don't have infinite free time, but always keep in mind in graduate school the reading list is a starting point, not a limit, right? And so you may do some other, you may find some other things. You may read in these papers and find a reference to something and want to go read that. Or you might say, wow, if you mine these articles, I think you're going to be in good shape. I pick them with that in mind. So I really am setting you up here. Although at the end of the day, it is going to be a bam, there's no net, so preparation is probably good when there's no net involved. But just keep that in mind, that the reading list is always a starting point, not a limit. That more generally, when you are confronted with something you have to look up, like me with the Arab Spring, I had to go and look stuff up. I had to, get into JSTOR and say, what the hell have people, what have they learned about democratic transitions? And, I found research on it, found interesting things, and that's, you're always looking for something else. And so those are the, so I don't know how much you need to do in terms of going past this list, but I just wanted to keep this in your head, that this is the natural thing that you do, is that you go searching for these ideas. Very often you're looking for theories, because theories are explanatory, and thus they make predictions, and very often theories are useful for analyzing things as they're happening. If you want to know, hey, what's going to happen at the end of this, you look at the theories. But also the empirical stuff, you do want to have those little factoids about the world in your head, and so those are not, you don't disregard those by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, so in other words, read stuff. Last minute pointers here, and these are in many ways the first pointers, coming back to the things I've said before. When you're writing an essay here, build a foundation in the theory and literature. That's your starting point. You want to be coming from this point of view of hey, immediately put a theoretical context on it, frame your answer based on the theory. And in doing this, keep in mind that theories are not all realism, liberalism, and constructivism. And if, as I tried to point out, for liberalism, you can't just go with liberalism. You've got to go down to, I've got you reading Cohen, Mr. Neoliberal Institutionalism, right? So we're going deep there. But you've got to get into the more what I call topical theory, the more, these realism, liberalism, and constructivism are kind of the grand theories or families of theories, and a lot of times you got to get down to the topical theory, the more applied or the more specific theories, right? Of hey, how do we think these things work? How do we think the world works? What are the causes of terrorism? Right? Not something you need this week, but that's very interesting. There's a lot of theory about that. Is it realism, liberalism, or constructivism? I don't know. You can have more sociological explanations, which would be more like constructivism. You can have more economic explanations, which is more like liberalism. But I really, in the end, I don't think of it that way. It's like these are theories of terrorism. There are theories of economic development. There are theories of international institutions. There are theories of human rights. And some of them may fall in these general categories of the grand theories, but more often they are, or more important, the more important aspect of them is that they are trying just to explain this specific phenomena, and they're on topic, right? Like that's why I call them topical theories as opposed to these grand theories. And when you're gonna have to talk about something, you need those. Throughout the program, as you go through the program, you're going to want to collect these things. Whether you call it arrows in the quiver or tools in the toolbox, whenever anyone has a idea about cause and effect in the world, you're going to want to put that, you're going to want to grab onto that, understand the basic part of it, understand the fungibility of it. Where else can I apply it, right? Cohen might be looking at the International Energy Agency, but where else could I apply this? Can I apply it to the UN? Can I apply it to an analysis of human rights? Can I apply it to the EU, the WTO? Where else can this be applied? Can I apply it to security issues in terms of cooperative security? Where can this thing fit? How many places can I use a flathead screwdriver, right? And some theories, like a flathead screwdriver has more non-traditional uses than a Phillips head screwdriver, I think, because of the prying, right? But the more, so some theories will be more fungible than others, but you can use them, and that's always, those are, you just want to keep them around, right? And you want to collect them. And this is what I mean, prep for it. You've got to go through, right, and for this exam, you're probably going to want, the old-fashioned way would be to have 3x5 cards, which is really old-fashioned. But in your computer, you may want notes, and you may want an author, and the bullet points. Or maybe you want to, have a PowerPoint presentation for yourself, right? Which is really very, very much like 3x5 cards, with a slide for a guide, or you may have several slides. Scholars have been known to come up with more than one theory, but this is the kind of thing you want to do. You want to collect, paying that, putting that premium on, remembering the name, keeping the, where the hell did this come from? When you take notes, by all means, do the full citation, right? Whenever you take notes, always have the full citation, because it helps you find the original. And it helps you, if you're ever writing, so if you ever write papers in this program as well, and there's nothing worse than, you've got something, well, Cohen said this, right? Maybe, and you forget the date, or you don't have the complete citation, and well, oh, damn it, I want to talk about this, I want to include it, but now I got to go back and find the thing. If you have the complete bibliographic information, well, then and you have some notes on it, well, you're good to go. You start talking about it, put it in your paper. So whereas I'm going to tell you that in your final exam, the last name is enough for a reference. In writing, you do need the full reference. And so in note taking, I always recommend capture. First thing, as soon as you're looking at something, capture the complete bibliographic information, and sometimes that's just cutting and pasting it. With computers, it's really easy, but that should be like the heading on your notes, and then whatever your notes are. Throughout the program, try to prep that way. Try to keep that going. Okay, so building a foundation in the theory and the literature. Always a good starting point. And another helpful hint, when you have to pick questions, right? You have to pick questions like you do this week. You have 2 questions, pick one. Very often, the criteria for selecting one of these things can be which one is the starting point more obvious. Where do I have the better foundation? I may be a little more vague on what the final answer to this question is going to be, but if I have a good starting point, I'll get to an answer, and I'll get to it in a way that's likely to pass or get an A. And okay, go for that one, not the other one. In this case, you're going to have 2. I think you just whichever one you're more interested in or you feel more comfortable with. Once you've built that foundation, make sure that the next thing is make sure you directly, fully, and explicitly answer all parts of the question. Right? And by the way, these 2 things very much line up with knowledge of the subject matter and analytic skills. If you directly, fully, and explicitly answer all parts of the question based on a foundation, logically based on a foundation in the theory and literature, you'll have an argument that will probably pass, right? I may disagree with it. Maybe, there's no right or wrong. And it's like math. Show your work. But here you go, and you're going to get credit for, if you have something that starts on in the right place in the literature, and you have the basic concepts right, and then you make a logical argument from those to an answer. You infer an answer to the question from that foundation. You're going to be good to go. However, the key thing that I have to emphasize here is, one, make sure you do that. When you write, make sure that you are directly answering the question. That is to say, what's the question asking? Right? Make sure you're talking about it. If the question is about the effectiveness of the UN, don't give me a lot of information about the origins of it and why it came into existence. That's the different dependent variable. That's the development of the UN. Make sure you are giving me also the answer, right? That is, I should be able to point to a sentence where you're giving an answer to the question. You would be amazed at how many people leave the answer implied. And it makes sense in some ways, because when you're writing and you're writing all these things that, here's the foundation, and, when you're writing, you're taking a lot more time with what you're doing than I'm taking reading it. A hell of a lot more time. Right? Because think about how long it takes to write something and how long it takes to read it. And so you've got a lot going on in your head. You've got a lot going on that isn't on the page. And so there will be things that have occurred to you, that are obvious to you, that are in your head, that aren't actually written down. Right? And so it'll be obvious to you, but it's not in the writing. It's not obvious to the reader. It's not explicitly written out. Right? That's where the explicitness comes in. So always be careful of that. Make sure you are, you're making these logical inferences from your foundation. Right? You're making an argument based, here's the theory, and then therefore logically this is the implication. Make sure you're saying that, right? So I can follow you, right? And make sure you do that for all parts of the question. Right? Don't only answer half of it, or don't give short shrift to one part of the question. Not every part of the question needs to be of equal length, but there should be substance to it, and as appropriate. So that's why the all parts is very important. Very often in a test-taking environment, writing a quick outline, right? Taking that time to just say, here are the points that I have to make, and maybe structuring it. If you have a multi-part question, maybe structuring that outline around the parts, and then around the point, and then as general as your top categories, as your top headings, and then your subheadings are the points you want to make to answer the question. An outline usually helps to guide you through, to make sure you're not giving short shrift. Also, in a time, you can kind of see where you are in the process. I got 90 minutes, so I got to get all this out, right? And so outlines are often a very good way of, disciplining yourself and making sure that you are hitting all the parts of your question. And like I say, just remember, tell me the answer. Along the way, as I kind of mentioned, avoid unsupported assertions. History shows, and statements about the world. We've seen that terrorism is sweeping the world. Really, and that's kind of a sweeping generalization. I could also have here, although we do generalize a lot. Avoid overly vague kind of general things. Generally, in other words, avoid being a CNN talking head or a Fox talking, any kind of talking head. Name names. Can't emphasize that enough. Just the cold chill I get when I open with an essay and I read, and I just instantly don't. I don't see. Your eye can pick them out, right? Especially if you're putting names in parentheses, and when I don't see that at the beginning, I'm like, huh? And now it might be more integral to the text, but usually I quickly I'm like, hey, there's no citations in here whatsoever, and I just kind of go, how the hell do you expect to pass? Why are you doing this to me? And to yourself, but why am I? What do you think I'm going to do? So make sure you name names. Get to it. One other thing, I guess I could have put here, just a thing. Get to the point. Go straight at it. Don't. A lot of times I see these kind of literary intros and people kind of providing a transition, which is maybe you're just warming up, or not you, because it's someone else who did it, because you have never done anything wrong. These other people, though, maybe they think they need to transition in. Maybe it's a warm up to get them going, and because getting started can be very difficult. I do generally argue it's better to warm up on an outline than a introduction, a transition. You don't need to you don't need to go into the whole history of things. You don't need to go into background, because background is information that is not explicitly related to a point, at which point it's irrelevant. Who cares? If the information is relevant, by all means put it in there, but in the context of I told you that to tell you this. This is directly relevant. This is an integral part of it, and at which point it's not background, right? So try to avoid those things. Go straight at the question, right? And don't worry about being elegant. Go straight at it. Go straight at each point, building the foundation, starting with the theory and the literature, and then arguing from it to an answer to the question. That is how it needs to be done. All right, I've labored this point. Good luck with this, and I hope this course has been useful. If you come out of it doing these things, and you don't have to have mastered what I'm talking about here. It's an introductory course. By the end of the program, you need to. And so, if you've started on this path, I think you can be happy with where you are and confident that you're going to go through the program. And it's the first time in the barrel. This takes some time. You got a year, at least, in most cases, to come around to this thing. And so, just this is the path you're on, and don't be discouraged if you don't get an A on the paper, but on the final. But if you can move on and start doing these things and collecting these informations and start thinking theoretically, I think you'll be surprised at how much your thinking will evolve and change, and you'll, at the end of the day, you'll do well on the comprehensive exam and graduate, and everything will be wonderful and happy. So we'll hold hands, we'll sing Kumbaya. So if you're a little discouraged now, have faith, it'll all work out.